So welcome everybody. This is the second session of the New Member Institute. I want to thank all those of you who were in attendance at the first session. If you were not in attendance at the first session, hopefully you've seen our email that includes the video recording of the first session. And if you haven't seen that, we'll make sure you get it either following this meeting or otherwise, because it was really, I think we heard a lot of good things from the people that participated, and it's always a good way to start. I want to also recognize that we've got a number of our both veteran members and members of our board of directors. Christine Benson is with us, who is our current board chair. I see Ken Karaya, who is our current new member representative. Let's see, who else do I see? I know there are a number of others there, and I'll leave it to them to make themselves known as we go. Let's. I always like to start my presentations at New Member Institute with a quick recap of NASBE's mission. Our mission: we are a membership organization for people like you who serve as members on state boards of education. We're the only organization in the country that does this. We are nonpartisan, and we are committed to developing, supporting, and empowering the citizen leaders on state boards of education to strengthen our public education systems so students of all backgrounds and circumstances are prepared to succeed in school, work, and life. I hope you can read those words yourself and reflect on the great work that you and your board are doing each and every time you get together, and in between your meetings and through committees, through your policy development work, through the actions that you take in the interest of the excellence of your education system. I've already been starting to talk to people about back to school. In fact, I was on the phone with one state, and schools are, it was Nashville Public Schools is starting already the first week of August. And I thought, that seems so quick, but that's not uncommon anymore, where school districts are beginning to bring schools back together. Here's today's agenda. We're going to have an outstanding presentation on parliamentary procedure by the wonderful Darlene Allen, who has been a longtime friend and presenter for NASBE. She's a professional registered parliamentarian, has in fact served in offices with the Parliamentarians Association, the National Association. She's just a wonderful presenter. Part of that presentation will be a little demonstration. I've solicited 5 of you new members to sort of play roles in that. I've distributed the scripts, and we will be presenting that to you for your edification and to also motivate your questions and your comments and your reflection. Then we'll take a short break after that's completed, and we'll shift to the amazing Abigail Potts on our staff, who is our lead champion for leading with evidence and data, and she'll give you an eye-opening presentation about what that might look like from your vantage point. And you will see that NASBE continually emphasizes the use of data and evidence in the work that we do. You'll see it in our publications. You'll see it in our Power of the Question. We always think that's the first best way to start. What data do we have? What research relates to this particular topic? Because it's a great starting point. It's often very neutral, very factual, and it helps to build those discussions about, okay, now we understand what are those things that tell us how we can do better. Then we're going to pivot to, I'm going to do a bit of an introduction to NASBE, because so far you've heard a lot from NASBE, but you really haven't gotten deep into what our organization is and how we function. We'll do a big, quick overview, during which Valerie North will also talk about our various publications and see if any of you are interested in, either collaborating with us in writing things or being part of the work that we do in producing those written publications. And then we'll end with some breakouts around our key policy priority areas. And while we have sort of 5 priority areas, we've actually clumped them into 3 areas: early childhood education, healthy schools and student well-being, and teachers and leaders, and high school redesign. Now, what I want to do before we go much further is actually see that I have people willing to participate in each of those. Who of you comes interested in the early childhood education issue area? And that seems to be the breakout that you'll want to join. Raise your hands, or otherwise indicate that that's of interest to you. And one of the things will be, we'll want you to kind of chime in about either issues that maybe your board is already working on, or issues that you see in the state that maybe need the board to pay attention to, or things like that. I see a couple of hands on early childhood education. Yes, okay. What about teachers and leaders and high school redesign? Who's going to be interested in that breakout session? Okay, I see Julie's hand up. Stephen, any others? Leanne, Nick, Okay, good, good. Now let's go to student wellness and healthy schools. Who might be interested in that particular area? Denham, Patty Nugent. Patty, do you go by Patricia, or is it okay to call you Patty?
I go by Patty.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, all right. So I think we've got a good sense. And as you go through the earlier part of the session and even the information about NASBE, feel free to recalibrate. We want to make sure that there's good representation in each of these areas. We've got amazing things happening in the early childhood space. I know many of you are champions in that area. Winona does a wonderful job, a lot of great examples of both the work NASBE does and the impact that it's having. Some of our more emerging work is more the teachers and leaders in high school redesign area. And then Selena and the team, we've been doing some interesting partnership work in the student wellness and healthy schools area, and always looking for more interest among our members in that regard. Now, the other thing is this new member representative. Ken Karaya is our current new member representative. He was elected at last year's New Member Institute. And this, we need to elect from those assembled here. We're not going to do the election today, but I need to get a few names of people who are interested in serving this function, because we're going to vote on it at our next meeting in August. We asked for some people to step forward between last meeting and this meeting to see if you were interested. We had one individual, and Angel, I want to thank you for stepping up, but unfortunately Angel is from Guam, and our bylaws say you can't have two people from the same state or territory on the board of directors at the same time. So unfortunately Angel can't serve in that capacity, but I'm hoping by the end of this session to have at least one or two other people sort of step forward and say, hey, I'd be interested in doing that. It doesn't require, it's not a big time commitment. It's not a big work commitment, but you become the voice of the new member at our board of directors. The board of directors meets, mostly virtually for an hour. We just had a meeting last week, 5 times a year. Once or twice a year, we meet in person, and we cover some of those travel expenses. So it gets, again, it's not a heavy lift, but I want to put that in front of you because I really want to end today with at least a couple of names of people. If you have a feeling that you're going to be one of those people, put your name in the chat. I'll ask this question as we get to the end of the presentation as well. So right now, we're going to launch right into the first part of this presentation.
Thank you, Paolo. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So let's get started on our basic parliamentary procedure. And if you have questions as we're going along, if you could unmute and just kind of interrupt me so that we can hopefully get your question answered right away. And so as they stated earlier, I am Darlene T. Allen, a professional registered parliamentarian. I am the past president of the National Association of Parliamentarians, and I also am a member of the American Institute of Parliamentarians. Today, we hope to provide information to help you manage your meetings more efficiently through preparation and using parliamentary procedure. And hopefully you'll take home something that you learned today to be able to help with your meetings. So today we're going to cover the history, some basic parliamentary procedure governing documents, types of meetings, navigation tools, talk about the consent agenda, motions, debate decorum, amendments, voting, and then we'll have the demonstration. And so the history of parliamentary procedure, General Henry M. Robert was in the Army Corps of Engineers. And basically he helped to build the Galveston seawall and lighthouses. So this all got started because he attended a church meeting and he was elected chair. Some 14 hours later, once he got home, he said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And this is why we have Robert's Rules of Order newly revised. It's in the 12th edition now. The 12th edition was released in 2020. Every 10 years, the Robert's Rules Association does indeed release a new copy of the book. So what is parliamentary procedure? It's parliamentary law combined with rules of order that work toward the orderly transaction of business and meetings. Why do you use parliamentary procedure? To conduct meetings that are effective while the decisions are made in a fair and consistent manner. And when do you use it? You use it in the absence of common courtesy and common sense. The basic principles are: you honor the will of the majority. The minority has a right to be heard. Also, the protection of the rights of absentees, courtesy and justice for all, and you're considering one subject at a time. And notice I didn't say one motion at a time. And so as you're doing and you're preparing and you're learning and you're practicing and you're using parliamentary procedure, you have to keep your governing documents in mind. First of all, the federal law and any judicial precedent that's there, your state law and judicial precedent, any laws or ordinances for your particular area in which you were elected, any charters, constitution, bylaws. There's no hyphen in the word bylaws, special rules of order. As a parliamentarian, when I see that someone, a group, an organization has special rules of order, that says to me there's something in those rules that goes against what your parliamentary authority says, and that's Robert's Rules of Order. And basically, what I find and what I see, and especially when I review the videos of school boards across the country, is that people normally come in with their own preconceived notions of what parliamentary procedure is. And that's why there's such a big problem, especially when it relates to Robert's Rules of Order. They're bringing in their habits from other organizations. They're not necessarily the correct habit, and that's the reason why people hate it so much. And you hear all of that, oh, Robert's Rules of Order just bogs us down. They're misusing it and they're not using it properly. But the special rules of order allows for an organization, a school board, to have rules that go against what Robert's Rules of Order says. And it's okay to do that. There's a process by which you use. The members of the school board have voted on it. So that is a reality that can definitely happen. But just to know that you see on this little chart where Robert's Rules of Order stand, but they're all the other types of rules and documents that come before it. So know that it has its place, but it's standing in a line waiting for its turn, just like the others. Then you may have standing rules, which are administrative rules, any policies and procedures that you may have, and custom. And so if there are any questions just about that part, if you can unmute and ask your question. Okay, I'll move on.
No, I have a question for you.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that seems to be really plugging us up right now is approving standards and kind of a standards process. And we have discussed creating a very specific process where board members can get engaged. And we kind of have a dispute going on between those that are saying, no, Robert's Rules allows me to put this in anytime I want, anytime, even if it's the very last vote of the last, I can make an amendment to change it. Could we create a process that puts a very specific spot in where the board members have input, but that kind of limits them later on as we've moved through, and that be a special rule of order? Or
and that's where that would lie. So first of all, you would make sure that by putting that rule into place, you're not violating any of the other rules that come before it, your charter or any local laws or ordinances. You want to check with that first. Then otherwise it would go into the special rules of order. But even the special rules of order have to be voted upon by the members of the school board, so that there would be a process by which members who disagreed with it were able to voice that, and finally a vote would be taken. So yes, that is possible, and yes, that's where it would go in the special rules of order after the school board, the Board of Education, has checked all of the other rules to make sure that you wouldn't be in violation of any of the other higher ranking rules.
perfect, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I can't see the hands raised or chat, so that's why I asked you to unmute. So the types of meetings: regular meetings, special meetings, adjourned meetings, an annual meeting, and this includes other organizations, your Board of Education may not have that executive session, your public meetings, and your meetings basically should be as formal or informal as they need to be. An adjourned meeting is a meeting where, say, we're meeting today, we didn't get through everything on the agenda and we needed to. So we can set up an adjourned meeting, which is a continuation of today's meeting, but it must occur before the next regular meeting. So that's something usually specific because something, again, you lost a quorum or there's an item that you wanted to particularly discuss. It has a very specific parliamentary meaning. But again, you want to make sure that you're checking your other rules to make sure there is no violation that is being called. And as your school boards, basically, you have a public session. Sometimes the public is allowed 2 or 3 minutes before or after to speak or whatever, but all of those rules just need to be followed. Executive session, you may or may not have rules that judge that because a lot of state boards of education have to follow their sunshine laws. So again, you want to make sure that you are consulting the higher ranking rules when you have these sort of things and have these sort of meetings scheduled to make sure that you are not in violation of the higher ranking rules. So we'll talk about the navigation tools, the agenda, and if your Board of Education does not have a standard agenda, Robert's Rules of Order does have a suggested one. First of all, with your meetings, you want to make sure that there is a quorum present, which is the minimum number of members who must be present at the meetings of a deliberative assembly for business to be validly transacted, and that is your quorum. You should refer to your bylaws to get the information about the quorum. And since we are basically in a new age, we are dealing with virtual participation where some boards of education, some organizations are having meetings that now include a virtual or an electronic component to it. There may be some people present in the room, but we found it's more effective to have both, having a hybrid available for members, or then there's some groups that are just have gone or tried to go back to just in person. But the last 3 years have basically, we've become more comfortable with having hybrid or electronic meetings. So if you are indeed continuing to hold your meetings in that manner, there should be the authority to hold them electronically, either in your bylaws or there's some statute that allows you to do that, like local or state. There should be rules to govern the meeting and the process to recognize the speaker, to make motions, to debate, and to vote. And I find with organizations becoming more comfortable with using the virtual applications, some have forgotten that you really still need a team of members to help handle the technology parts. The person that is chairing shouldn't be the one that's monitoring the chat and pushing the polls and that sort of thing. Someone else should be assisting with that. That's a part of it. Was very, very efficient when we worked with teams doing that in a virtual environment. And that's something that does not need to go by the wayside if indeed you're still meeting virtually, simply because it hasn't changed that it's hard to juggle all of those single things at one time. And that's not going to go away, especially if more members choose to attend virtually as opposed to being there in person. And even if you have some of your members that are there virtually and then also in person, you've got to be able to balance who gets recognition to speak, the people in the room. When do you call on the people that are there electronically? So there does need to be a plan, and there need to be other helpers in order for there to be a fair distribution of assigning the floor for the members to speak. So the order of business, and it may be arranged according to the rules that you have, any special rules, any custom or by the person that is preparing the agenda. The governing documents of the public body will determine who may place items on the agenda and whether or not additional items may be added at the meeting. There may be an instance where it had to be, an item may have had to have been added to the agenda or requested to be added to agenda sometime ahead of the actual meeting, 2 weeks, whatever, but all of those rules should be consulted first to make sure you're doing that. A sample order of business, that's in Robert's Rules of Order. If you don't have one, there would be the call to order, any roll call to determine who's present and whether or not a quorum is actually been established. The first actual item of business is the approval of the minutes, any reports of officers, boards, and standing committees, any reports of any special committees, special orders, and that's more so other organizations. Special orders are those things that your bylaws say have to occur at a certain time, such as the nominating committee gets elected at this particular time. Those sort of things would be special orders, either the bylaw stated or at a previous meeting, a particular item of business was made a special order for that particular meeting. Again, we're meeting right now and we're seeing that we need additional information. For next month's meeting, when we're going to meet, we can make the item a special order or the special order for the next meeting to give it the appropriate importance that it may need. So not just the bylaws, but also if the members decide to make an item a special order for the next meeting. Any unfinished business and general orders, and you notice I didn't say old business, and any new business that may occur before the body. The consent agenda, usually legislative bodies use consent agendas, and that could be used to handle any routine, non-controversial items of business that requires no debate with a single vote, meaning everything that's on the consent agenda would be voted up or down, and that way they would come off of the regular agenda. So adopting the agenda or approving the minutes are an example of items that you would put on the consent agenda. Usually it's going to be non-controversial things. However, if there's something on the agenda and the chair or the president is asking for approval of the consent agenda, any member can pull an item off the consent agenda and it will remain with the regular order of business and available for discussion. And I believe that especially boards of education use consent agenda quite frequently, or legislative bodies. And so does anyone have a question about that? I think you guys may be familiar or have seen that used. Okay. So how to adopt the agenda? When the agenda, when it's proposed and it's pending, it's basically subject to amendment by a majority vote. So it's the item of business on the agenda. We're talking about the agenda. Members can propose changes to it right then and there, and it will only take a majority vote to adopt it unless your rules say something else. After that initial agenda has been adopted, there can be no change except by a 2/3 vote of those present and voting, or a majority vote of the entire membership. That would be of the entire membership of the Board of Education, the members that are there, or unanimous consent. And unanimous consent is a way by which voting or decision-making has been undertaken without actually taking a full vote. So unanimous consent is the way by which to do it. And I have a slide later that talks about unanimous consent. I just wanted to introduce you to it right now. We'll come back to that later. And I put the reference in the 12th edition there. So let's get into motions. The main motion is how the business comes before the body. The subsidiary motion, they actually assist the body in considering or disposing of a motion. The privilege motions do not actually relate to the pending business. Incidental motions relate to the pending business at hand and must be decided upon immediately. And then there are motions that bring a question back before the assembly, or the bring back motions. You basically have changed your mind. Now, at this particular point, there is a chart that I asked to be distributed to the members. The chart is created by Jim Slaughter, who is a fellow parliamentarian. And I'll take this opportunity to say there are quite a few parliamentarians that create, I'll call them cheat sheets and materials that are free to the public. And so you can usually go online and download the materials at no cost to you. But there's a chart that Jim Slaughter has basically created that gives you the information about the motions. The key to motions, there are 13 motions that require, that have rank, meaning when one is on the floor, whether or not another may be on the floor or being able to be discussed depends on the rank and how they fit on in the proceedings. So it's important to be familiar, especially with those 13 motions. And that chart does give information, gives you the name of the motion, the language that you would use in order to bring the motion on the floor, whether or not debate is allowed, and the vote that is required. And so that resource is available to you, and it'll probably be in your electronic packet. But just to know that I have asked that you be given that information for you to take back with you. Are there any questions before we really get into motions? Okay, so you heard me say that motions have rank or precedence. Basically, at the bottom, you have to visualize a ladder. At the bottom is the main motion. While the main motion is open and on the floor, the motion to postpone indefinitely could be made. Postpone indefinitely is the motion where that would be used to kill a main motion or any motion. Postpone indefinitely. It is sometimes mistaken for the motion to lay on the table, but with the motion to postpone indefinitely, again, the intent is to kill it for the remainder of this meeting, and that's the motion that should be used for that. While postpone indefinitely is on the floor, the motion to amend could be also made. The motion to amend is where you're wishing to change the motion. You can have a primary or a secondary amendment. While amend is on the floor, someone could decide, oh, we really can't make that decision today. Perhaps we should send that particular motion to a committee, refer it to a committee. And that doesn't happen often enough where discussion or debate is occurring, a particular item, there doesn't appear to be any resolution to it, or at least you won't be able to get to it today in today's meeting. The best thing to do probably is to send it to a committee. If you're going to send it to a committee, you can send it to a committee that is a standing committee, or create a matter to a committee that you haven't informed the committee of when to report back. Other than that, that particular matter can just languish in committee because the committee hasn't been given any direction of when to report back to the members. Also, while that motion is on the floor, the motion to limit or extend time for debate, that motion requires a 2/3 vote in order to adopt, because it could be taking away someone's ability to debate if the point is to basically cut off the time or to limit the time that a motion is being discussed. I've seen that used, and I'll say a good way, when before that particular motion is on the floor, is already on the agenda, that this particular item we're going to discuss for 20 minutes or 10 minutes. Members already have the knowledge that there's going to be a limited time or that has been scheduled for this. However, members can extend that time, but that comes through that motion to limit or extend time for debate. It's usually better to give the members an idea of that there may be limits placed on it, and have or set it or putting on the agenda, because it appears as though you pick on someone when, especially if it's someone that's known to be long-winded and they get recognition to speak, and then you say, oh, you can only speak 2 minutes on that or that sort of thing. And if it all only happens to that particular person, but everyone else had the opportunity to speak, it does look as if that person is being singled out. So you should handle that in a way that if all of your motions are going to have limits to the time to speak, that should be known to all the members ahead of time. Robert's Rules of Order states that if you don't have a rule that says otherwise, every member gets to speak twice for 10 minutes each time to every motion. And I do serve organizations who have a special rule of order that gives the member 3 minutes or 2 minutes, because they know that they would be there all night if they allowed for basically 20 minutes on each motion. So those are things that you think about, and then you make a part of your rules. The members vote on the rules in order to basically save time during debate. So that's on the floor, the motion. Previous question, you may know it as I call the question. Calling the question requires a second. It's 2 steps. The first thing is, once the motion is made and there's a second, the presiding officer does not automatically stop the discussion or go to the motion, the main motion for a vote. You have to decide whether or not debate is going to be halted. So that's the first step of that motion. There's no discussion on whether or not you're going to stop discussion on a motion. The chair asks, basically, are you ready for the question? You go through the steps, you vote. If it requires a 2/3 vote because you're cutting off debate, and it could be violating someone's right to be able to speak. And once that decision is made, whether or not to stop debate, then you would go to the motion that's on the floor, the pending motion on the floor. This seems like a lot of words right now, but it's just something that as you think about it and as you practice it, it becomes easier to work with and to handle in your meetings. And my advice would be, if there is more than one motion on the floor, as you see the way that I'm proceeding through the ladder, and there would be, if there are more than one motion, if there's more motions on the floor, I would call the question on all pending motions. Because if you don't do that, only the one that is immediately pending would be the one that would come under scrutiny for the motion to call the question. Once that decision is made, that vote would be taken, but everything else that's still on the floor, because you did not end debate for the others, discussion could continue. So previous question, then the motion to lay on the table. And you heard me earlier say that there's usually confusion between lay on the table and postpone indefinitely. The motion to lay on the table should be used when there's something urgent that comes up. There's something urgent and you want to temporarily put aside the matter that you're discussing. You intend to get back to it. With postpone indefinitely, you do not intend to get back to it during this session. With lay on the table, you can either have it taken off the table during today's meeting, or it must be done by the next regular meeting. But the point is that you intend to get back to it. So that's usually used improperly. There is a distinction between lay on the table and postpone indefinitely, and probably 9 times out of 10, when someone moves to table a matter, they really mean that they want to postpone it indefinitely. Call for the orders of the day. One member has that particular right. It's a call that to the presiding officer that you're off topic, you're off the agenda, and you're asking the presiding officer to get back on topic, get back on the agenda. So one person can call for the orders of the day, and the presiding officer needs to go back to the agenda, raise a question of privilege. You're in the room, it's too hot, it's too cold, there are sidebar conversations, there are people moving about, there's a lot of noise, those sort of things. And it could be something that's disturbing the body, or it could be something that's disturbing one particular person. So raising a question of privilege is something that a member can use. Recess, you want to take a small break in the matter. It depends on whether or not there's business on the floor or not, whether or not discussion is allowed. That's when you get to the intermediate, we can talk more about that particular motion, whether or not it's a privileged motion or it should be handled as a main motion. To adjourn, members should meet no longer than they choose to. So members can move to adjourn the meeting even when there's still business on the floor. If it's interrupting and there's something on the floor, the motion would require a second, no debate, and then a vote is taken whether or not to adjourn the meeting. And then fix the time to which to adjourn. I thought it was so important that I wrote it twice. And basically that's what I stated earlier about an adjourned meeting. We're in the meeting today, excuse me. Something has happened, we've lost a quorum. We need further information. We're nowhere near filling all of our time with a particular matter. We filled the time up and we still have a lot of agenda items to go. We can fix the time to which to adjourn, which it means to have a meeting to continue this meeting. And as I said earlier, but it must occur before the next regular meeting. That was a lot to talk about motions. And so I'll pause here for any questions that you may have. So feel free to unmute. Okay, I'll move on.
Maybe I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Because one of the things I've seen, especially if things get complicated, let's say you've got a motion and somebody moves to amend, and then somebody moves to amend the amendment. And then at some point, the chair says, okay, let's, we're gonna vote. Sometimes people are confused about what they're voting on. What's the best way for a person who may have lost their sort of place in the order of where things are to kind of try to get that clarified?
And what I would say, and we do have slides on amendment, it's going to be up to the person that's serving as the secretary and the presiding officer. And if you have a parliamentarian, to work through the motions, and they should be all on the same page. When a main motion is there, then you have a primary amendment and a secondary amendment. They need to have what's on the floor at that particular time, so that if the presiding officer misspeaks or if a member doesn't know just where are we, they are helping to provide the presiding officer with that information, excuse me, so that the presiding officer can remind everyone where you are. And so everyone could, exactly what you're about to vote on because you've been reminded of that. So that's really record keeping, a note taking process that the parliamentarian, the president, and the secretary are working in tandem with that. So it is up to the presiding officer to keep everyone on track and to remind everyone. And that can be done in several ways, either when a member has seemed to have lost track of where you are, or the presiding officer, in anticipation that members may have lost track, to get in there and remind the members, here's where we are.
Yeah.
And as voting is about to take place. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Okay, I'll move on. And so when you're having this, and I said that the motions have ranked, these motions have ranked, you start at the bottom and you would work your way up the ladder. And that's how the motions would be made, the ones that have rank. And then how you process them, you start at the top and you would vote on the one at the top, then the one below that, and that's how you would both make and process the motions that have rank. So let's get into handling a motion. The member would get recognition from the chair, and that is if you're a State Board of Education, you're usually seated at some sort of desk or on the dais, and you have a way by which you signal to the presiding officer to get recognized. So the member needs to be recognized and then makes a motion. Then another member will second the motion. And you'll see that I have an asterisk there that I'll explain as we get to the end of the list. Then once the motion is made and seconded, the chair states or repeats the motion. Once the chair repeats the motion, that motion is before the group, the body. The motion now belongs to the group, and it no longer belongs to the maker of the motion. So then the members will debate the motion through the chair. And then once it appears that all debate has stopped, and the chair might even ask, is there further debate? And just kind of look around to get a feel for the body. And then the chair puts the question or the motion to a vote. And then the chair announces the result of the vote and the effect. The chair cannot stop debate. The chair cannot take it upon himself, herself, to stop debate. Only the members can stop debate. And not all motions will require recognition. Not all will require a second, and not all motions allow debate. And the chart that you heard me speak of, when I said that Jim Slaughter, that I had that copy of it attached to the things that are going to be distributed to you, that gives you an idea of whether or not a motion requires a second or not, and whether or not it allows debate. But that basically is one of the keys of motions, learning those characteristics of motions in order to put motions forward on the floor. And so that regular people like me don't have to watch your school board debates and hear someone say point of order 100 times, and it may not have been the proper motion to use in the first place.
We put a link to the Slaughter chart in the chat for those of you who want to download it that way, and we'll also send it out in our follow-up materials.
So with
Colleen?
Sure, you have a question?
Yeah, quick question. On the vote, when is it appropriate for, a show of hands, a voice vote, a roll call vote? Lots of ways a vote can be taken.
And I would say that if you're the chair, you kind of, it's because sometimes that's nuanced. So it just depends on what motion, whether or not the motion requires a majority vote or not. Usually if it's a majority vote, for the most part, you can do voice vote or, show of hands, but usually it's a voice vote with majority vote. The motions that require 2/3 limit or extend the times for debate or the previous question, you can't really tell whether or not that received 2/3 of the vote. So the show of hands, at least someone is able to get a visual, whether or not you count it, you can see whether there are more hands up for the yeses than the no's. So I would think it depends on the voting threshold. So majority vote, probably by a voice vote, whether or not it requires a 2/3 vote with hands, and the roll call vote, either that'll be through your custom, and there are certain votes that you regularly, routinely vote by roll call, and then some maybe you're not, but it does depend on how your group regularly, votes and does things, and the minutes should reflect that. So if you go back and take a look at the minutes to see what type of votes were taken and the method by which it was taken, depending on it, and, routine stuff, majority vote, voice vote usually.
Darlene,
did I answer? Sure.
Can members ask for a roll call if they want a roll call to be recorded?
Yes, they can. And I do have, we will discuss that because there's a process by which you're to use, unless your rules say something different. So we'll just hold on to roll call vote for just a second, and we'll get through this, and I'll discuss that in further detail. Okay. So withdrawing a motion. And so right now, and I did put this here on the side, we talked about the steps to making a motion. Before the chair states your motion, and that basically is at step 3, when the chair would repeat it, because once it's repeated, it belongs to the body. The person who made the motion, before you get there, can withdraw the motion. Once it's been repeated and you're about to get into debate, then the person would need permission from the body in order to withdraw the motion. But once voting has already begun, you cannot withdraw a motion because the voting needs to be completed. So that step 3 is very, very important, whether or not the chair, the presiding officer, the school board president actually repeats the motion, because it belongs to the body at that particular point. So I have one question. What is the forbidden phrase? Is it A, so moved, B, I so move, C, I want to make a motion, or D, I motion? What do you believe is the forbidden phrase? And you can just unmute and holler it out. You guys are not feeling confident.
Moved? Is it
You're not
so
feeling confident?
moved?
Go
You're
ahead,
not
Lisa.
feeling confident.
Is it so moved?
Okay, so that was a trick question, all of those. So moved is not appropriate. I so move is not appropriate. I want to make a motion. I motion. All of those would be inappropriate. If you're an individual or an officer, I move to, or I move that. Once the presiding officer and the secretary hear those words, they know that a motion is about to be made and they are preparing to capture the motion. Now, if there's a motion made and is long and drawn out, the secretary can request that it be in writing. The presiding officer can request that it be in writing. And if it's coming from a committee of more than one, on behalf of the whatever committee, I move the adoption of the following motion. So you're giving everyone a clue by saying those words that a motion is coming forward. And I so move is not a motion. So debate is equal to discussion. Parliamentarians probably will differ on this. I have found that debate is the most formal way of using it. You'll hear parliamentarians say, are you ready for the question? Or are you ready for debate? And I tend to have the non-parliamentary groups that I work with say, are you ready for discussion? Simply because there are people who take that word debate literally, and they really are ready to get into a knockdown, drag out fight with you when you say the word debate. It's just something about that word that does that. So if using the word discussion helps, then because at that point, the motion is going to be open on the floor, because you're at basically step 4 in the steps to make a motion. Are you ready for the question? I usually kind of gently nudge non-parliamentary groups away from it, especially churches, because we say, are you ready for the question twice. The first time we mean, are you ready for a debate? The second time we mean, are you ready to vote? There's nothing more hair raising and have you ready to pull your hair out. Then you're going through the steps. You're only at step 3 and you start to ask, you go into step 4, are you ready for the question? You haven't even had discussion yet. So you're not ready to vote. And then you'll have members go question, and you're not ready to vote. And so because they get confused in the sequence of whether or not you're asking them if they're ready to discuss or if they're ready to vote, sometimes it's just simpler to say that. It depends on your particular organization, your school board. Some people are sticklers and they like to hear the formal language. And if that's where it is, then that's what the presiding officer should do. But again, the presiding officer should ensure that members know that when I ask you, are you ready for the question? Right now, I'm asking you, are you ready for debate? As opposed to, are you ready to vote? So making sure that's clear and where you are usually keeps down a lot of the anxiety that occurs when that question is asked. And so the members should confine their remarks to the motion that's on the floor. What they're speaking to should be germane or related to the business that's on the floor. The maker of the motion can speak first, And the other members can speak 2 times for 10 minutes each time, and they can't speak a second time until others have spoken. So how do you do that? That's when I spoke about having a team of people, having the secretary or parliamentarian, someone is keeping a queue. That way it's fair to the members to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to speak who chooses to speak. So also while, and boards of education are not necessarily, don't necessarily follow this rule of debate, but you should refrain from attacking a member's motive, because it's the issue and not the person that is under debate. All your remarks should be addressed through the chair. Avoid using names where you can. The maker of the motion can't speak against his or her motion. If you made the motion, you can't speak against it. You need to refrain from disturbing the body. And if the presiding officer wants to speak to the motion, that presiding officer needs to relinquish the chair. And if the member of the school board is the parliamentarian, section 4755 is what they should use, unless your rules say otherwise. Usually, and that's the reason why you normally have an outside parliamentarian if you're going to use a parliamentarian, because the parliamentarian does not have the freedom to be able to speak to all of the motions, because they're supposed to be given unbiased information, unbiased, basically advice to the presiding officer. If you know how the parliamentarian feels every step of the way, I don't think unbiased is how you would label it, so that a person who is a member of the board who's serving as a parliamentarian, unless your rules, and it definitely has to be in your rules, say otherwise, they don't have the freedom to be able to speak to a motion, step out of their seat, speak to the motion, and come back. And some years ago, being a member of AIP, we did have a situation where we were at our annual meeting and we had to replace a couple of parliamentarians because I think they forgot that they did not have that freedom to do that. And we had to vacate the chair and put someone else in who understood the role of the parliamentarian. So it's a little different if you have an outside parliamentarian. If you basically ask either the school board members or the chair asked for the parliamentarian to give clarification, that's one thing. They just cannot take it upon themselves to insert themselves in the conversation. Decorum. If you follow, sure. Mm-hmm.
Quick question. They at our New England town meetings, which mostly has parliamentary procedure, we're quite rigid in addressing everything to the moderator, and you can't ask questions to each other. You can only ask questions for the moderator. Is that what you mean by that? That's that second one?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because everything should be addressed through, and again, you call yours the moderator. All questions should go through the moderator. And they absolutely, what you guys are doing is what should be occurring.
Yeah, they're usually pretty rigid about that. It keeps the town folks from talking to each other.
Exactly. And so with decorum, someone else had a question?
Yes, darling.
Okay, sure.
Angel. In our meetings, in our board meetings, when somebody makes a motion, and I didn't see it anywhere here, before we even get into debate or discussion, someone has to second that motion for it to go to debate or discussion. I don't see anything here about anybody. If I make a motion for another member to second that motion in order for it to move forward.
It is on the slide where I have the steps to making a motion. So when you get the slide deck, you will see that.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And Angel, just to let you know, if there was ever a case where someone made a motion and you actually got into discussion and then someone says, oh, we forgot to get a second or whatever, it would be too late at that particular point once discussion is stopped. But on the slide that tells you the steps to making a motion, it does have where a second is needed, but all motions don't require a second. So when you get the slides, you'll see that there.
Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So with decorum, if you follow the rules of debate, you should not be called to order. And that's what it is, because it's the issue, not the person that is usually out of order. If that happens, if the member is constantly being disruptive, the chair can call a member to order. If the chair fails to correct the situation, another member can rise. But if your situations, you're not rising, there are other ways by which you're getting recognition, you do that, and that person can call the member to order. Basically, that results in a point of order because of the lack of decorum. And so a member can do that if the chair has not taken care of that. So unanimous consent, and I said I would mention that this is a way to make a decision without actually having to take a vote. The presiding officer would say, if there is no objection, and they would pause, we will do such and such. So there's that pause waiting for an objection. If you hear nothing, then you would declare whatever action to be taken. If there is an objection, the chair would start with step 4 and the steps to handling a motion. The floor would be open for debate through the chair. Then the chair would put the question to a vote, and then you would announce the results and the effect. Now, if it's a motion that does not allow debate, the chair would go straight to number 5. It just depends on whether or not the motion would allow debate. And the chart that they put the link in the chat, that chart gives you information about whether or not debate is required or a second and that sort of thing. So these are 5 motions everyone should know. Call for the orders of the day. And I said with that one member, you've gotten off the agenda. It's a demand to get back on the agenda. Request for information, you're asking a question. You're asking a question because you need further information. Parliamentary inquiry, you're asking a question. Is it in order to do this at this time? Is this motion in order? You're asking a question. Point of order, you believe that the rules have been broken. And the previous question, and we had talked about, is the motion that's going to stop debate, and that there are 2 steps involved, and it requires a 2/3 vote. So amendments in general, you're going to change words or groups of words. You have to say where in the sentence that you want to change the words. Insert, you're specifying where in the sentence. You always add at the end of the sentence. You want to strike, you can strike out words. You strike out words, insert words in the same place or somewhere else. Substitute, that's a paragraph. It's a little more involved when you're amending paragraphs. You can have a primary and secondary amendments if amendments are allowed, but you process in the reverse order, the secondary, then the primary, and then the main motion is amended. The exercise is going to take us through this, and then it takes a majority vote to adopt primary or secondary amendments. So add or insert, strike out, and insert. Friendly amendment. It's a myth of sorts. It's a misnomer. Usually someone will say that because they're basically, in general, they are in agreement with the approach that the person is making through the motion. They just believe that there needs to be an amendment. And once you get to step 3, where the presiding officer repeats it, it belongs to the body, the members. So it's really a myth that it's a friendly amendment at that point. And it's important that the person that's presiding understands. Once you've gotten there, it doesn't matter that someone said friendly amendment. It needs to be processed like an amendment would be processed. Amendment would be on the floor, it would be a second. And if it's able to debate, you would debate it. You would go through those steps. There is no need to ask the maker whether or not they accept a friendly amendment once the motion has been put back out there at step 3, because you're about to go to step 4. And the presiding officer should process the motion using the steps. Yeah, I've been in several situations where someone has made a motion. We're at debate. So the presiding officer has already been to step 3. We're at step 4, where they're making motions and having discussion through the particular presiding officer, and someone moves to amend. Even though they said friendly amendment, it didn't matter at that point because the body has the right at that particular point to change the motion. And this member was very upset. she said no, she would not accept a friendly amendment. So then they had to call me over because everyone else was on Zoom and there were about 6 of us in the room handling the control central. So I had to stand behind the presiding officer and explain about step 4. And, very nicely, it doesn't belong to you anymore. The members can do anything they want to this particular motion at this point because it's no longer your motion. And she was very upset. She turned off her camera. She did all of that, but she did not, it didn't belong to her anymore at step 4. It belonged to the body. So by presiding officers carrying on with this myth, it does give the false impression that the maker does have the authority to say no to anyone who wants to amend the motion. And after step 3, they don't. So it's important to know that. So basically, during debate, a motion may be amended if that motion is debatable. There are motions that are not debatable, and I put this section in Robert's Rules of Order if you have time and you just want to do some thumbing through. Basically, you want to state the amendment, and this is the presiding officer, and the person would make the motion, because the amendment is a motion. I move to amend, and I have stated earlier, you have to tell us specifically by inserting, by striking out and inserting, or by adding. Say specifically what words that you want to change. Tell us specifically what you want to do so that the secretary is there waiting to capture this. The presiding officer is there waiting so that they can repeat it. So if the amendment is adopted, the main motion will read, you're reminding people, if this is adopted, this is what the motion will be. And then now you go back to reminding everyone what the amendment is. You repeat, to insert such and such, to strike out, you go back and repeat it. And so this is why I was saying it does require at least the 3 of you all, someone's taking the notes so that they can pass this to the presiding officer so that they can stay on top of it and they can remind the members when you get to that point of where it is, what language is being proposed to be changed, because if someone has a copy of it and they're passing it on, you may also require that members write down these sort of things. That's something as part of your rules, you could ask that to be done. But the point is, those 3 people should be working in tandem to make sure that the body is assisted in knowing what motion is on the floor and what the likely effects would be if it's going to be adopted. So just a few more comments about this. Adoption of an amendment does not automatically change the main motion. What it does is it puts the main motion sort of like in a limbo. It's in a modified form, but it's just there. The final step is it's going to be adopted and you're saying to yourself, okay, this is our final decision. Do we change the words in the main motion? So that's a question that's being asked by going through the steps of the motion, and that final vote is going to be taken, or it can be done by unanimous consent. And if, as a presiding officer, you use unanimous consent, you need to always pause to allow for any objections, for someone to say, I object. Usually when that's done, it just means that they want the vote to be recorded. They want a formal vote, as opposed to using unanimous consent, which is a way to make a decision without having to go through a formal vote. So that's what's happening when an amendment is on the floor, knowing that it's not done just because someone made an amendment. It's got to be adopted, and then it gets tacked on to the main motion, and you have to have that final approval of whether or not you tack it onto the main motion, because there could be a primary amendment, there could be a secondary amendment. And I know right now this is might be a little over your heads. Someone could decide they want to create a blank, and there could be a whole lot of other suggestions that they want to make. That's just opening the door to what could be. But just know that there's a process, and it should be an orderly process when you want to change a main motion and that there's usually an organized way to do it. So I'm going to pause here for a second, but I'm going to go to the next slide to make sure that we get time to go through the exercise. Okay, so we'll go on to roll call voting. The secretary or the recording member calls the name of each board members. Members will respond aye or yes for an affirmative vote. Members will respond no for a negative vote. And members can also say pass. That means you're not ready to vote. So the secretary is going through the list. Usually the list is alphabetical. And once the secretary has gone through the list, you return to anyone that said pass. Also, members that are responding present, that means they intend to abstain. So the secretary is not going to go back to them because they basically already indicated that they plan to abstain. So the chair is usually called on last to cast a vote. And in some cases, depending on your rules, because you're a legislative body, you may require that the president or the chair also votes. In a lot of organizations, the way that Robert's Rules of Order is written for a roll call vote, the president is only called on if their vote is going to make a difference, that is, to make or break or tie. Other than that, if there's no reason and there's not going to be a tie made or a tie broken, the president isn't usually called on, but your rules may be different. Always check your rules. And so then the secretary or the person that's recording is going to tally the number of counts for those in favor, those opposed, and the number abstaining. And then that information is given to the chair or the presiding officer, and that person is the one that declares the results of the vote. Now, under other circumstances, when you're voting, you normally don't take abstentions, but when you're taking a roll call vote, especially if they answer to a constituent, that needs to be a part of the process. And so to make the motion, it takes precedence over the motion being voted on. So the motion is on the floor and someone decides, I think we need a roll call vote for this. And it can be applied to any motion and the method of voting. So that can happen. It cannot interrupt the speaker. So that means that that person who wants to make that motion has to get recognition and be called on by the chair. He requires a second. It is not debatable. And I put some references there. It can be amended, and it's usually a majority vote that you use for adoption. I put information also in about abstention because that gets kind of confusing. Because you're basically a legislative body, it's probably important that you are recording who abstained because you answer to a constituent group. So under regular organizations, if you're abstaining, it's like not showing up on election day. They don't mention you at all. But for legislative groups, it may be important. So I put that information for you to read about abstentions. So we're down to, these are the sources that I use. Are there any questions?
Darlene,
Yes.
you mentioned as part of the voting, member can pass. Now, what if that member continues to pass every time their code is there? Would it be, does it have to be in our bylaws that they can only pass 3 times before it becomes a yes or a no vote or something like that?
Yes, it would have to be there. Mm-hmm.
So 3 times they pass, it's a no vote.
I would say if they passed the first time and when you went back to them the second time, if they still were passing, it was to the point where they did not want their vote to be known, and you should create some rule of what to do for that. I understand that people think that everything runs in 3s in Robert's Rules of Order. You went through them once. Lots of times when someone passes, they're trying to see how everyone else voted. And then once you get back to them, they'll be ready to vote. But if they're doing that, they might as well have abstained if they don't have anything to add to it. They might as well abstain because it will
That's
be
correct.
recorded that they abstained.
And so they wait to see how others vote. So, but what if you've already voted aye or nay, and then before the vote results are announced, you raise your hand and you say you want to change your vote?
And you would need permission at that point. So the body could give you permission to change your vote because the results had not, yes, and because the results had not been released. It's just that everybody else is probably sitting there taking a tally. So you know, but the official results have not been released by the person that's chairing the meeting.
And a member can also call for a reconsideration of the vote, can they not?
I would say only after that would have to be in your rules because you would need a reason to do that, especially if it's a roll call vote and you know how everyone voted. And so the motion to reconsider basically has to be made by someone who voted on the side that prevailed or the side that won. So after you hear the vote, usually some business may transpire, and then someone who voted on the side that won, either the yeses or the nos, only that person could be the one to move to reconsider the vote on whatever it is the vote was. It would require a second. And then whether or not it would be appropriate to take it up at that time is important, whether or not there's some other business and that other business needs to be taken care of first. The motion can be made, but it may not be in order to take the vote on it at that time. So the motion to reconsider, what I'll do is I'll add a slide about reconsider because that's something that's important because reconsider is time dependent. So the motion to reconsider at a monthly meeting would need, like we're in a meeting today, would have to be made before this meeting ended today. Other than that, next month, you'd either have amend something previously adopted or to rescind. Those would be the motions that would be available to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Quick
Are we
question.
ready? Oh, go ahead, Leanne, you have a question?
Yes, just quickly. Can the motion to call for the vote, so to end debate and call for the vote, can that be disallowed?
My answer to that would be no. The way you disallow it is to vote no.
Okay, so a member can bring about the call to call the question.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Shall we proceed with our little demonstration? I'm proud to present the New Member Institute players. Denham will be portraying our board president, Denham Ward. Ken Correa will be member A. Leanne Wood will be member B. Patty Nugent will be member C. And Lee Keener will be member D. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Hopefully, show me members that are actors. Are you ready? Very good. Then Denham Ward, take it away.
Okay, well, I didn't get everybody's names from which
That's
participant.
okay. You can just refer to them as members A through D.
Yes, so I'm going to have to refer you. So I apologize and not giving your names and doing a generic thing. So the scenario starts out towards the end of the meeting. So the meeting has already been going on, and this is getting towards the end of it. So the next item of business is new business.
Madam, Mr. Chair.
The chair recognizes member A. The chair recognizes you.
Yes, I move that the Board of Education host an open house for parents, students, and the community on September 2nd, 2020.
Second.
It is moved and seconded that the Board of Education hosts an open house for parents, students, and the community on September 2nd, 2023. Is there any discussion? The chair recognizes the maker of the motion to speak first.
I believe it's an opportunity, Mr. Chair, to allow this open house to occur so that we can get input from parents, students in the community on the issues at hand.
Is there further discussion?
No, Mr. Chair,
Chair recognizes member B.
I move to add at the old Central High School building.
Second,
It is moved and seconded to amend the main motion by adding at the old Central High School building. If the amendment is adopted, the main motion would read that the Board of Education hosts an open house for parents, students, and the community on September 2nd, 2023 at the old Central High School building. The amendment is on adding the phrase at the old Central High School building. Is there any discussion? The chair recognizes the maker of the amendment to speak first.
I think that that's a better location for the event. It's centralized to the city and it also has the largest meeting space.
Is there further discussion?
Adam, Mr. Chair,
Chair recognizes member C.
I am opposed to the amendment of the Central High School. I believe that the Central Elementary School would be better because it has access for handicaps. It has handicap access.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none. The question is on the amendment to add at the old Central High School building. Those in favor of adding at the old high school, at the old Central High School building, please raise your hand. Those opposed?
Nope, everybody should play the part of the voters. Mr. Chair, it looks like there was 2 affirmative and 16 negative.
So there were 2 in the affirmative and 16 in the negative, and the amendment is not adopted. The question is now on the main motion that the Board of Education hosts an open house for parents, students, and the community on September 2nd, 2023. Those in favor of the main motion as amended, please raise your hand. Those opposed?
Oh, sorry.
Again, I see, and just a point of clarification, since it wasn't amended, we would have modified that language. You understand that. So I count, again, I count 2 yeses and 15 noes.
There were 2 yeses and 15 noes, and the main motion is not adopted. The Board of Education will not host an open house for parents, students, and the community on September 2nd, 2023. Is there further new business?
I rise to a parliamentary inquiry.
The member will state the inquiry.
Would it be in order at this time to make a motion about a board retreat?
Yes.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
The chair recognizes member D.
I move that the board retreat will be held during the weekend of November 17th through 19th in 2023.
Second,
It's moved and seconded that the board retreat be held during the weekend of November 17th and 19th, 2023. Is there any discussion? The chair recognizes the maker of the motion.
There seemed to be interest in having the retreat when we discussed earlier in this meeting. The motion about the crab boil failed when it was debated and voted on. Mentioning the crab boil when debating the retreat may have caused some confusion. We should have the retreat in November instead of August and without attaching other activities to the event.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none. Is there any objection to adopting the motion that the board retreat be held during the weekend of November 17th to 19th, 2023? There being no objection, the motion is adopted and the board retreat will be held on the weekend of November 17th to 19th, 2023. Is there any further new business?
Mr. Chair?
Chair recognizes member D.
I move that a special committee composed of members B, A, and D to be created to research the pros and cons of requiring clear backpacks to be used for all K-12 students during the school year 24-25.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that a special committee composed of 3 members, B, A, and D, to be created to research the pros and cons of requiring clear backpacks to be used for all K through 12 students during the next school year, 2024-25. Is there any discussion? The chair recognizes the maker of the motion to speak first.
So my rationale is that for older students, it provides more access for teachers and security to see inside the backpacks for safety reasons. Any paraphernalia, any weapons, anything like that are less likely to be carried in a backpack. In the younger grades, we can see if a student brought in anything of value or a snack that might pose a potential allergy risk.
Is there any further discussion?
Mr. Chair,
Chair recognizes member B.
I move to postpone the pending motion indefinitely.
Second,
It is moved and seconded that the motion pertaining to creating a special committee to research the pros and cons of requiring clear backpacks be postponed indefinitely. Is there any discussion? The chair will recognize the maker of the motion first.
We've already had a number of meetings with parents and students, school administrators, and vendors, and everyone was, but the vendors, of course, were concerned with violating the privacy of our older students if clear backpacks were mandated.
Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the question is on the motion to postpone indefinitely. The motion that a special committee composed of members B, A, and D be created to research the pros and cons of requiring clear backpacks to be used for all K through 12 students during school year 2024-25. Those in favor of postponing the motion indefinitely, please raise your hand. Those opposed?
There were 15 in favor of postponing and 4 opposed.
Therefore, the motion is postponed. Is there further new business?
Mr. Chair.
The chair again recognizes member D.
Thank you. We have worked very hard during this term, and I move that we reconsider the vote to hold a crab boil on August 26, 2023.
The member moving the motion must state how you voted on the original motion.
I voted yes.
The motion is therefore not before the body. The motion to reconsider must be made by somebody who voted no, which is the side that prevailed. Is there further debate? Hearing none, is there further new business? If there is no further new business, the meeting is adjourned. The meeting is adjourned.
Let's hear for our actors.
But I really want the crab boil, so can I read?
Here in May, we wouldn't have a crab boil. We'd have to have a lobster bake.
Point of order.
So I'm opposed to a crab boil, but if it meant for a lobster bake, I would have voted yes.
so I have a, working through this, back to the first thing, now we have no meeting at all. So, I mean, in real life, would somebody have come back with a motion to have it at whatever building it was, as opposed to not having any meeting at all?
Right, once the primary amendment was lost to have it at the old Central High, when it was repeated, at that particular point, someone could have made the amendment to say to amend by adding the, I think you said the elementary, the old elementary. At that point, that could have been added into the motion.
So Darlene, I have a question on that first one. We had moved and seconded the main motion. And then we had some debate on that at that point. And then there was an amendment. And then we had the debate on the amendment, and then we voted on the amendment. After we voted on the amendment, we went right to the vote on the main motion.
Right.
Because that was because we'd already had debate on the main motion at the beginning.
At the initial debate is when the amendment was adopted.
Right,
And so once that amendment was lost, another amendment could have been made about the elementary school, the old Central Elementary School. No one made that amendment. And so it's like, you're at the point, nobody's having any other debate or discussion. The presiding officer needs to move it along and move it back to the main motion. And
Yeah.
that's the reason why.
but
With no one offering anything else, right?
but the way the script reads, I didn't give anybody else a chance to offer anything else. The way the
You
script
didn't?
read,
I thought you did.
no, I went right, once we had the motion failed, then the next one I read is the motion question is now as amended. Or not amended, and it went right to the vote. I didn't ask if there was any further discussion. Shouldn't I have asked if there was any discussion at that point?
You
Some-
could have,
It's on the second page, the top of the second page.
right? You could have.
Okay, because I really didn't give it, because when an amendment was made originally, that there might have been more discussion, but as soon as somebody made that amendment, we had to go to voting on the amendment, right?
Right. And so that if someone has something they need to offer, they need to get the attention of the presiding officer.
Right, so it would have been nice if I'd given people a chance to.
It would have been nice, but it's also one of those things that a simple Mr. President
You're right,
would have also allowed the same thing.
right. Thanks, Darlene.
Mhm.
Great. So my job today is to get you excited about data and evidence and state board policy making in the late afternoon session, and also give you a couple tips and tricks for what to do if data and evidence come before your state board, or what to do if data and evidence do not come before your state board of education. So a couple of things about why data and evidence matter and why we're taking time at a new member institute to talk about it. Well, first, it helps us identify real problems. Data can act as a flashlight and spotlight that compels action. When we look at data and information, sometimes we can tell that different groups of students have different outcomes or different opportunities. And it makes us think about why. And it makes us think about what more opportunities we can offer all kids. It also helps us weigh and compare solutions. Do we think that a particular solution can work for all kids in your specific state and in your specific context? Do we need to customize solutions for students who might be in a high poverty school or students who might be in a rural environment? So that ability to weigh and compare solutions, data really helps us with, because it gives us a picture of what that student's context is like. And data can also help build fact-based consensus. As you might know, there's sometimes politics in education, and people can have very different opinions about what to do. When we have trusted data sources, we can understand the facts around a particular problem or issue within education. And even if we may disagree on what the solution is or what the strategy or policy should be, building that common understanding of what the issue is with trusted data sources can go a long way to building that civil discourse in education that state boards really excel at. It also helps justify policy solutions. Consider a policy solution that you're trying to implement. You can point to research and evidence that says this policy solution has shown and demonstrated statistically significant positive student outcomes. That's compelling evidence. As well as maybe you're a state board of education considering dismantling a particular program or dismantling a particular regulation. You can point to it and say, well, here's some trusted data sources that's publicly available that shows maybe this program is not getting the intended outcomes that we had hoped for. So we can use that investment and allocate it towards a different strategy too. This is particularly helpful with publicly accessible data and when you're dealing with your legislature. But most importantly, evidence leads to informed decisions that are in the best interest of our students. The more we know about their context, the more we know about what works for each student in every context, the better off we are at designing policies that's going to get us the education system that we know all students deserve. So a couple of things that we'll do. I'll pepper in a couple quotes too, because data should be a lot of fun. And this is one that says, if we have data, let's look at data. If we have opinions, let's go with mine. So let's use data and evidence to get that common understanding of what we're all working for. One of the things I want to leave you with is the Every Student Succeeds Act game changer. This is the federal legislation that governs K-12 education. things like Title I. And it had in legislation, evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based resources and strategies. And what do we mean when we say evidence-based? It's really about an activity or a strategy that demonstrates a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes or other relevant outcomes. So we know for certain that there's evidence that shows that this particular intervention is going to do good things for kids. And there's different levels of evidence in education too. There's strong evidence, moderate evidence, and promising evidence too. And I want to make sure that you at least touch on these. They can be a little bit complicated, but you can refer back to the slides and you can always ask NASBE staff questions about this. Strong evidence is our gold standard. It allows us to really unpack and understand a causal relationship. Does an intervention result in an outcome for students, regardless of their background, regardless of their past test scores? We know for sure, accounting for all of those aspects, that the intervention has resulted in a positive outcome. Strong interventions are experimental design studies. You've heard of things called randomized control trials, where students are randomly put into two groups, one with an intervention, one without the intervention. And that allows us to really understand that causal impact for an intervention strategy. But in education, sometimes randomized control trials are difficult to implement. In a completely hypothetical one, let's think about the intervention being an out-of-school suspension. You can imagine if you're going to randomly assign students to an out-of-school suspension, parents might balk about participating in that particular study. So we also have something called moderate, where we look at students who are participating in an intervention, and rather than randomly assigning students to an intervention or not, we try to come up with a comparable group that has a similar background, similar set of test scores, similar set of dynamics that we haven't randomly assigned that are already in our education system. This is a quasi-experimental study. It helps us to still unpack that causal relationship without that randomized control trial. Then we also have promising. Promising is about correlation versus causation. We know, for example, that let's say we increase funding in these particular school districts, and outcomes also increased in these particular school districts. Those two things are correlated. We don't know for sure one caused the other. So that's what promising data is too. And oftentimes at the state level, they'll look a lot at correlational data in your state boards of education conversations. But I do want to flag one last thing that is in the Every Student Succeed Act. There are a lot of words here, but I basically call it the good idea. Because if you know, we haven't tried everything possible in terms of intervention strategies for kids in education. So we might have a very strong experimental study with randomized control trials that shows for a particular group of kids some miraculous positive outcomes. But you want to try something slightly different in your state. Maybe it's tweaking the intervention, maybe it's tweaking the student to teacher ratio for it. And what you need to do for this particular level is to make a rationale, a logical argument that even with this modification, you could reasonably assume that that intervention strategy will result in positive outcomes. But that also requires that you couple it with ongoing evaluation. So we're building our collective knowledge about how that good idea is actually going to work and can build our collective body of evidence. So that's the ESSA levels of evidence. So you might ask the question, I think this is fabulous, this is great, this is going to help me so much on a state board of education. Where do I get information? Where do I get data? And the answer to that question is we can actually get data. And you can have data shown from the US Department of Education, you can have data from federal statistical agencies, you can have data in Newsweek, you can have data in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, from advocacy organizations, civil rights groups. One of the challenges is we have a lot of data, but how do you actually have information to make decisions? And one of the challenges is being data rich, but information poor. So one of the things that we're going to walk through is about those data challenges. We have data everywhere, and maybe it's telling us different things. How do you determine whether or not data are sound, whether or not you should use them for decision making? And sometimes you can find that there are two research studies that have conflicting findings. Study A says that there's a positive outcome for students with this intervention strategy. Study B says there are not positive outcomes with this intervention strategy. What do you do? And it's all about turning those reams of data into actionable information by asking questions and just thinking about, does this make sense? So tips on data sources. And I am aware I'm about to give you 3 words that are going to sound quite boring, but I hope you walk away with them. Tips on data sources, trusted data sources. Top of my list is federal statistical agencies. And yes, that is sounding quite boring, but federal statistical agencies are empowered to be impartial, as accurate as possible, purveyors of data and information out to the US public. Things like the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and for education, the National Center for Education Statistics. To give you an example, when the National Center for Education Statistics wants to release a new data file or a new report, they inform the US Secretary of Education. They don't ask permission to release the report. They tell the secretary it's coming out the door, give them a little bit of advance notice to prepare any press release or to prepare a response. But the federal statistical agencies, and I'll read this quote because I'm a former NCS commissioner, have to be credible. A statistical agency must be clearly impartial. It must avoid even the appearance that its collection and reporting of data might be manipulated for political purposes. Federal statistical agencies are governed by OMB for a strict set of protocols on data quality, data review. It can be a little bit of a lag in terms of information because they have such strict protocols. So you might find data that's a couple of years old, but at the same time, trusted data sources, federal statistical agencies come top of my list. Other things that you can use to evaluate data and to think about data are powers of the question. Asking questions about data is something that I'm pretty passionate about, because when you ask questions about data, you're going to come with more questions about data. So for example, what data do we have on a topic is a question that a state board member can ask. If you have a particular, let's say, assessment revision before you, or you have a particular accountability system revision before you, you want to know, what data do we have on this? What evidence do we have that this could be successful? Are there certain caveats around this? Maybe you've tried out some new metrics for your accountability system, done a preliminary run of them. And maybe you found that, hey, look, we're finding really interesting things going on with the inclusion of students with disabilities. Maybe we need to reevaluate this. So what caveats around the data are really important to understand. What evidence is there that the policy will be successful is another great question to ask. What evidence out there is there? Are there research studies or findings that suggest that this intervention is going to work in my state in a particular context that I have for particular kids at a particular grade level and a particular locale? The more specific we get, the better designed that policy solution will be, and the better we're setting it up for success. Another really important question to ask is, are there different outcomes for different contexts or circumstances? Is this intervention going to work for students with disabilities? Is this going to work for students who have visual impairments, orthopedic impairments, students with intellectual disabilities? Getting down in the details matters. Now, with all of that, there's a tremendous power of convening, because data is really about a story about people. It's about students and what they're experiencing. It's about teachers and what they're experiencing. It's about administrators and what they're seeing and what they're doing. So when we bring data and numbers to a state board meeting, I also always encourage folks to bring along the people that they represent. Because when we couple that data and information analysis with their own story, that qualitative and quantitative information, that's where we're really getting the information that we need to be able to make good choices in the best interest of students. So how to spot quality research? A couple tips here. Spotting quality research, the first thing that we want to think about is objectivity. In education, you'll find that institutions of higher education might release research reports, but you'll also find that advocacy organizations, foundations, a variety of different institutions will also release research. So we want to think about the objectivity of the study design, of the quality of the research. So do the researchers show evidence of any pre-existing bias or policy agenda? And if so, are they at least honest about that or upfront? There are several institutions that do high quality work in education research who, yes, may have a policy agenda, but they're upfront about it, they're honest, they articulate it, and they put forward a transparent study design that's been reviewed by a multitude of different people. So think and consider objectivity. Next is think about the study design itself. Is the sample population large enough and diverse enough to justify drawing conclusions that are applicable to a whole state? So for example, say someone is pointing to a particular study design and maybe it's a strong evidence study design for a particular intervention that you're considering. That's great. You're using evidence in your decision making, but you got to challenge you even more. Look at the sample population. Is that sample population similar to the sample of students that will be implemented in your particular state? Are there students who are culturally diverse? Are there students who are economically disadvantaged included? All of those are really good questions to ask about study design. But I will say, the last question is perhaps the most simple, but the most important. Are the results convincing? Do they make sense? Can you follow the logic? That is what actually is the easiest question to ask to determine the objectivity and the quality of the study design. So asking the simple question, are these results convincing? Can I follow the logic pattern, even if the results are counterintuitive? There's a logical sense and pattern to it. So I encourage you to ask those questions, because I have the quote at the bottom that if you torture the data, it will confess to anything. And yes, you can write a report about how that tortured data has confessed to anything. But I can almost guarantee you that if you ask the question, do the results make sense? You will be able to identify tortured data. So next are questions to ask about using data. I will spare you from sitting on my soapbox to tell you that data for data's sake gets me excited. But really, data for data use is where we want to be. Questions about using data are really thinking about, are we using information in a way that is helping us make good decisions for kids? And question number one that is always important to ask is, what is the purpose of this information? Because there are a fair amount of capacity issues with collecting information and data. Folks have to report it, and we want to make sure the data that we have is the data that we're going to use. So what is the purpose? Gets at an underlying question of validity. And so validity is all about ensuring the evidence supports the data for its intended purpose. So if we think, for example, about assessment data, and data for assessment is about understanding what students know and can be able to do. In order for that data to be valid, it really has to align with state content standards that say what the student should know and be able to do at a particular grade level. And it has to align to the cognitive complexity of the standards. So are we assessing that critical thinking skills that are matching the standards as well as the same content? All of those things are pretty critical when it comes to validity and understanding the purpose of the data, so that we make sure when we're using assessment data, we're ensuring that it's accurately measuring the full breadth and depth of the state content standards. We also want to ask questions about, is it fair and accessible? Fair and accessible, what we're really talking about is considering all of the different kids that we possibly could have who are engaging with this particular indicator or measure. Students with disabilities, English language learners, culturally diverse perspectives. Do they all have an opportunity to show what they know and can be able to do in assessment measures? Or for accountability systems, are we thinking about alternate schools and their unique circumstances too? Is it fair and is it accessible? Then we also want to think about who's using the information for what actions too. We wanted to kind of come back to the purpose of using data and information is to make actions taken by schools and districts and administrators that better support students at the school level. So we want to think, when we talk about data and data use, almost think about it as a plot in the story. Who are the lead characters? What are the actions they're taking? And what's the result of those actions? When you think about that from a data perspective, who's using the information for what purpose towards what end, we are really getting at the underlying data utility. Being able to articulate answers to those simple questions helps us get better data utility. And then I also encourage state board members to ask questions about, are we providing those resources and capacity building that empowers educators to act on data after we've developed a story, this plot about the lead character taking that action based upon data? Do we have the resources and capacity that helps them, supports them to take those actions in the best interest of students? So I'll leave you too with a couple of tips on using data. And we'll go through these pretty quickly, but at any time, feel free to chime in with a question. And then I'm trying to leave a couple of minutes. I do talk fast for a little activity. So the first kind of tips on using data is as we kind of reflect back to the beginning about those different levels of evidence, know that correlation is not always equal causation. Even though you saw some really compelling data about how these two school districts did something new, maybe they increased their gifted and talented enrollment for students of color, and then another outcome happened that suspensions were significantly lower, but doesn't necessarily mean there's causation. So think about correlation versus causation. The second thing I want to leave you with is no data is perfect. I know the caveats and the error in data. I will confess, education data is messy. We have a wide range of different school configurations, different grade configurations, different locations, different levels of enrollment. And when we think about definitions that we use in education, we're usually thinking about schools that would fit that definition about 80 to 90%. But there's always unique situations out there. And there's always unique situations out there where a definition is not going to match the student's context. So for example, the National Center for Education Statistics collects data on library media specialists and library media funding too, as well as revenues. When we think about a school or district that might have a combined elementary and middle school that share a library media specialist, we want to think and know caveats around interpreting and using that data in that unique situation. But we also want to know, number 3, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That situation of two schools potentially sharing a library might be the exception rather than the rule. So there's good quality evidence in there that we could use. We want to be able to use it, knowing full well that there will always be some best data out there. Number 4 is really about unmasking variations hidden by averages. When we work in education, I really think we're all trying to unpack and understand each unique student's context and make sure that they're getting the education that they deserve. And oftentimes looking at all student averages really does mask that information. So we want to get into a level of detail, asking questions about, can we see this information disaggregated by race and ethnicity, by gender, by EL status, by students with disability, by disability category, race, ethnicity, and gender, and EL status. And really understand, is it following the same pattern across all of those groups, or different groups showing different patterns? But as we get down to those fine level of details and those nuances, we also want to consider number 5, student data privacy. My rule in data is always do no harm, and you want to make sure you're not disclosing individualized student information. So when you think about that situation where you've really disaggregated numbers down, and you're finding something, and you want to talk about it, but it's 2 students with an intellectual disability who happen to be Hispanic and also EL. And if you were to talk about that in a public meeting, a reasonable person in the school community could guess who they were. We don't. We want to make sure that we protect individual student privacy. Number 6 is data is about more than numbers. Those 2 students, they have a story around them. It's about their story, their experiences, their outcomes. So data is always about more numbers. And the compelling use of data usually pairs a story about a student with the scope of that issue too. So for example, think about access to AP. And if you look at some data about access to AP, and you're starting to understand and reveal that maybe in your state, high schools and rural areas don't have the same access to advanced placement courses, like advanced placement computer science, as potentially more rural and urban areas. And you engage as a state board member, you hear a story about a student, tell that story about that individual student, and also tell the story about how much that student represents similar students statewide. So comparing that story about individuals with stories about numbers is a really compelling way to use data in policymaking. Last is also to keep an open mind. We want to make sure that we're keeping an open mind about data, because you'll come to it, you'll ask data a question, it will ask about, let's say, what's happening in terms of student outcomes for mathematics achievement in my particular state. And then you'll kind of want to come back and ask more questions. What's happening about student mathematics outcomes for elementary school students versus high school students in my state? And then you'll want to come back even more and ask about female students who are at the high school level versus female students at the elementary level. So asking more questions and coming away with more information and more questions is a good thing. Keep an open mind when you're looking at it. Now, I think I talked fast, but Paulo, I think I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to
No,
jump
that's
back.
okay. You may proceed. We've got a little bit of flexibility here.
Okay, well, let me jump to the end. And I just pulled this data too, because I wanted to give an example of data that may come before you as the State Board of Education. And oftentimes when you have a school or district before you, you might pull their state report card or their school report card. And so this particular data was just looking at district enrollment. It's a very large district and it has a significant portion of students who are Hispanic. About 71% are Hispanic, about 21% are African American, and about 7% are white students. And I also pulled some data on out-of-school suspensions. And here we're seeing a relatively similar proportion of students who are receiving out-of-school suspensions. We see that that represents about 68% are Hispanic who received out-of-school suspensions versus 71% of overall enrollment. About 25% of the students who received suspensions were African American compared to about 21% of overall enrollment. And then we have a very different graphic on expulsions. So when I'm looking at data like this, I ask myself 3 questions. 1, because there's always a good story in there. What's one question I would ask the school or district that's about something that's an area of strength, a positive aspect of this data? What's a question I would ask the school district or identify as an area and opportunity for improvement? And the third thing I would ask is what data do I want that I don't yet have to better understand this context? And rather than opening up for questions and delaying this even more, I'll quickly walk through what I'm thinking here. And here I look at that graph for out-of-school suspensions, and it's relatively close to the overall graphic that shows district enrollment by race and ethnicity. Expulsions is a very different picture, but that number of overall expulsions relative to overall enrollment is quite small. So we got 2 areas that I potentially want to ask the school district about. One is their out-of-school suspensions being relatively similar from demographic to their overall enrollment. I want to ask about their low number of expulsions, but I also want to dig into what's going on with the racial demographics for expulsions. The question I want to ask for more information is what's the trend over time? Is this going up? Is this going down? In short story, for this particular school district, that trend in suspensions about 5 years ago was a very different pie chart with a much larger number for in size. For expulsions, that was a much larger in size as well. So with trend over time data, we see that a change has happened in terms of the proportion of students who've received disciplinary action, as well as the racial ethnic makeup in each of these categories. And why I wanted to highlight this was that these actions by this particular school district were all the result of publicly accessible data. There wasn't a compliance event from the State Department of Education or the US Department of Education. Folks looked at information, it put a spotlight on a particular issue. They looked at data and evidence and possible intervention strategies that would work to solve that particular issue and took action. So data compels action. And that's why we use it in education. And with that, I'm done. But open it up for questions.
Great. Yeah, I was going to say, let's take a few questions before we transition to the next segment. Who's got a question for Abby on data, evidence, or related topics?
Yeah, I got a quick question, or maybe not quick. Abby, great presentation. This is maybe too technical a question. I'm coming at this not from the education research side, but from the clinical research side. And back when you talked about the experimental, quasi-experimental, you said the intervention should have, I think it was clear indication that it was would be an improvement. And at least in clinical trials, we have an ethics called equipoise, and the intervention should be, I don't know whether it would be better or worse. Is that not used as much in educational research?
Really good point too. I mean, so the intervention could actually also have a negative impact too. We want to make sure that we're using the interventions that are having a positive impact upon students or no impact as well too. So you're absolutely right to call me out on that too. It's not necessarily that it's only positive impact, it's that the study design is able to identify whether or not it's causational for positive, and the results also could be negative or no impact actually, to be quite frank too.
Yeah, because you know, in intervention, we really don't know. I mean, that's the idea of it.
Precisely.
If you're 100% sure it was better or 100% sure it was worse, then maybe you shouldn't be doing that kind of clinical trial.
Exactly. And, with one exception, that we like to replicate, and just as like we like to replicate in clinical trials. So if there's been a randomized control trial that showed either positive or negative sex, we want to make sure that we can replicate that result again.
Right, of course.
Mhm.
Other questions for Abby? One of the things I love to do with data is look for the outliers. Like for instance, in that district example, it might be interesting to see it every school building, right? And there might be one school building that's beating the odds. For some reason, they've got, you know, their graph looks exactly the opposite as the district level graph. So what's going on there, right? And it calls out those real on the ground examples of, wait a minute, something interesting must be happening here. And then it drives you to kind of understand, look, oh, I wonder what they're doing.
I have to confess, I'm a huge fan of scatter plots so that you can identify those particular things as well too. Mhm.
Yeah,
Very
Abby,
good.
I'm not a fan of, as Andrew Tufte said about pie charts, is at least since you quoted him earlier. Were those changes statistically significant? I mean, that would have been the first question that I would have asked. It's a pretty small N out of overall, and even though it looks dramatic on a pie chart, I wonder how significant those changes really are.
Exactly, yeah. So from my recollection, we did not do a test for statistical significance on this too, but from my recollection, we had some individual data from individual student data from the particular district, and there were statistically significant differences from the individualized data that we use, but I did not do any tests on that. But that's a great point to raise, right? When we're looking at small insights, we want to make sure that that change isn't due to random error. That change is actually really due to a difference that's substantive in there.
Very good, very good. We're always happy to answer your ongoing questions about data and evidence. And frankly, most of our, our publications are often very highly data informed. We try to do a regular data graphic or teaser in our regular member newsletter every month. So we're a collection of data lovers, because we're, anytime I get a report, it's got a great graph in it that tells a really good story, I'm always sharing that with the team. And we're talking about, what other ways to tell. We're also deep into, sort of data presentation. How do you make data tell the story that you want it to tell without making the user struggle in terms of getting to that information? So thank you, Abby, so much for that. You're now hopefully seeing my screen, Introduction to NASBE. I'm going to move through these slides fairly quickly because I do want to get to the breakouts, and I know my staff. What I love about my team and the NASBE team is that they're so very proud of the work they do, and they really want to talk to you about their projects, the networks we operate, the study groups, and all that kind of stuff. So once again, you're going to have the option to stay to do 3 groups. There'll be a group that will stay here in the main room, which will be focused on teachers and leaders, as well as our high school redesign work. There'll be a room focused on early childhood education and a room focused on student wellness and healthy schools. And we'll get to that point at the end of this short presentation about NASBE. So let's talk about NASBE. One of the things we do at NASBE is we divide ourselves into different areas that you see here, color-coded into 4 areas. We've got a Western area in purple, the central area that's in green, the southern area, which is in red, and the northeastern area in blue. Each one of these areas has both a staff liaison, you see the names of the staff liaisons here, as well as an area director that is voted on at our annual meeting by the meeting of the area. Each annual conference has a meeting of the area that is led by the current sitting area director. Area directors serve for 2 years, and then they are every other year, an area meeting will elect its new area director, who then sits on the board of directors. The area director in the northeastern part is Woody Exley from Connecticut. His term is wrapping up this year. In the southern area, it's Kevin Ellis from the state of Texas. In the western area, it's Maria Gutierrez from Guam. And in the central area, it's Patty Goebbels from Nebraska. And we often think about, now a lot of times I warn people, well, just because you're in the same area doesn't mean you have this, all the same issues. But we do find there to be a lot of peer-to-peer kind of interaction that makes sense at the area level. I wanted to share this slide with you because it shows a little bit more of our governance structure. And of course, you see at the very top is the NASBE membership. We pride ourselves in being strongly a member-driven organization, and a lot of that work happens in the course of the delegate assembly. At our annual meeting in San Diego in late October, the delegate assembly will meet. There'll be a representative from each of our member states, and those states that don't send representatives are given the opportunity to send paper ballots, voting in terms of our leadership and on some of our policy positions. And ultimately, one of the things I feel most comfortable about is when I go out and talk about things, I know that the positions that NASBE has taken have been approved by our delegate assembly. The various votes of that delegate assembly, as well as the area meetings, as well as this group of new member representatives, create the people that serve on our board of directors. We have a chair-elect, a chair, an immediate past chair, the 4 area directors, and a secretary-treasurer, as well as the heads of the National Association of State Board Executives, NASBE, and the National Council of State Education Attorneys, NCSEA. And those individuals constitute our board of directors. And then we have a set of committees that are called for by our bylaws. The executive committee, which is a subset of the board that tends, to deal with sort of high-level operational decisions of the organization. We have a nominating committee that's charged with making, collecting and forwarding the nominations for different offices that are ultimately voted on by the delegate assembly. We have a finance and audit committee that oversees our budgeting process and all the financial oversight that needs to take place. We have a governmental affairs committee that is responsible for monitoring issues of, the federal government's actions, sharing individual state government actions, and really staying informed about how government is addressing issues relevant to education. Our public education positions committee is the one that oversees our public education positions document and recommends changes to that document that are submitted to the delegate assembly for their approval. And the awards committee, which then makes the various awards that are presented at the annual meeting. Those are the ones that are called for. Oh, and the credentials committee, which serves a sort of a pro forma role at our annual delegate assembly in terms of credentialing all the delegates to make sure they're duly authorized by their state to participate. We also have some ad hoc committees, one of presiding officers that Janet Cannon leads. These are your chairs, your presidents, your chancellors, whatever they're called in your particular state. We see them as having a special sort of peer-to-peer relationship, and we try to do, this is a kind of a national initiative here at NASBE. We have a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, which really focuses on, again, some of our operational aspects of our organization and our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have a conference planning committee that spends a lot of time ensuring that our conferences are really of high quality and they have sessions that align to member interests. On the far right, you see a little bit of the structure of our organization, the staff, and so forth and so on. We also have in that pink box an editorial advisory board that is involved in overseeing the work of our journal, the State Education Standard, and weighing in from a board member perspective on the writing and the topics that are covered in that publication. I want to particularly highlight the Governmental Affairs Committee and the Public Education Positions Committee because we work really hard to make sure that every state that's a member of NASBE has representation on these two bodies, because these two bodies do some of the very, very important work of the organization. The Public Education Positions Committee is, again, the owner of our Public Education Positions document. In fact, right now, they are working on a couple of revisions to that document that will be presented to the Delegate Assembly for the delegates to vote on. And then once those changes are approved, then we know we can be out there saying certain things about whether it's teacher shortage issue or changes to assessments and accountability and what have you. So we work really hard to make sure states have one voice designated to be on the PEP committee. And the same is true with governmental affairs. If the federal government is considering legislation, or if there's state governments thinking about doing things, that peer-to-peer engagement, we also want every state to be represented at that table, both by virtue of sharing information about things happening in your state and also being that voice that reflects the role and the voice of NASBE in federal government advocacy and the work that we do in that area. We also provide a variety of technical assistance. I'm not going to go to each one of these in detail. We've just completed a variety of board self-assessments where board members take a survey that we work together with the board to develop, and they gauged, how everything from are their agendas, put together effectively and aligned to their strategic plan to do people, is stakeholder engagement effectively managed and as part of the process of the board. We do boardsmanship training. I just did some presentation to the Maryland State Board of Education during their retreat earlier this week. We can support state boards in strategic planning, either in helping them design a process for strategic planning or actually doing a start to finish strategic planning process with you. We participate in executive searches for either state chiefs or other high level positions that people are interested in filling and want some outside expertise to support. State chief evaluations, to the extent that a board appoints the state chief and wants some help in conducting evaluations, we've supported that. Retreat facilitation, often we'll do policy research and guidance based on requests from states, and then other generic information requests. We get those all the time, and we will either try to answer those ourselves or go to partner organizations that we know have an interest in those. I'm going to turn it over now to Valerie Norville. She's our editorial director, just to give you an overview of some of the main publications that are easily found on our website, www.nasbe.org, on the publications tab. Take it away, Valerie.
Thank you, Paolo. Yes, these are all open access. You can find them at any time by topic. There's a policy core areas tab. What's new is just generally on the front landing page or in the publications tabs, and Paolo's always mentioning them in his monthly newsletter as well. All of these publications, there are several formats we have, but they have several things in common. We, whether we write them or we have experts write them, we're always trying to ensure that the best available evidence is represented there, as well as state examples of policy solutions that have been tried and what has been learned from those. What we have done in talking with members over the years in focus groups and just one-on-one in chats with the editorial board is making sure that these formats serve you well. We keep them short, succinct, browsable, as much as it is humanly possible to do, so that you won't have to spend a lot of time and you'll learn something about a particular topic area. Paolo mentioned the state education standard. It's a little bit longer form. The main articles are, we ask experts to write them. It's always jollies me that so many people are eager to talk to you and write for you, really smart people who've thought deeply about things. I have my editorial board always weigh in on the themes. We have a theme for every issue published 3 times a year, which leads me to first ask, which is, if you are interested in this area, reading the articles first, weighing in on their clarity and on their utility for state boards of education, which is the focus of the article. 3 times a year, I will send you 6 to 8 articles, and you will send me a little email, and we'll have our great thanks. So contact me if that's something that you would like to do. But also, just generally, if you see things you like, I would like to hear about it. If you see things you don't like, I would also like to hear about it. If you see things that are missing, that you really, some resource that you can't find elsewhere, or it doesn't quite fit the state board frame, tell me that also, so that we can, begin to do some research and see what we can find out about what's going on, what research is being done. If you're proud of something that your state board is doing, and don't feel like we've represented it, or feel like it has some sharing value for others, let me know. I also want to know more about that. And lastly, if you are yourself a writer or aspiring to be a writer, it's been a great joy to just over the years work with many state board members to write themselves about things they know or initiatives they've worked on. So I'd be glad to talk with anybody and figure out the format that would work best. Just briefly, we have policy updates that are focused on a particular policy area. We have state innovations that are focused mostly on what states are doing in a particular topic. Powers of the question that are, I press all the authors to present questions that state boards can ask other people in order to advance a conversation in their states. And then there's the boardsmanship review, which is things about how boards operate.
Great.
Any
Any
questions?
questions for Valerie? And again, even if you're not a great writer, if you think there's a need to put some ideas on paper, we're happy to work with you and co-author. We often co-author with people around certain topics as may be relevant to the work of state boards. Very good. I will keep proceeding here. The other thing that we do a lot of are bring people together. Oh, I did want to ask, let me go back for a second. One of the things that we put out is our new our member newsletter. And I'm just curious to make sure that do each of you see our monthly newsletter come to you in your email mailboxes? Okay, I see some thumbs up. I see some heads nodding. If you are not getting our monthly member newsletter, let us know, because maybe we don't have your right email address, or maybe, a lot of times we find people have a Department of Education account, but they don't really refer to it very often. And if you prefer that we send you NASBE, we promise we will not abuse having a different email for you. But if it's the best way to get information to you, we'd love to have that contact information for you as well. We also appreciate having people's phone numbers, because it's always helpful sometimes if we're trying to get a message to you and we don't know whether you've gotten it, whether we can text you or what have you, and moving forward. So we like to stay in touch, and often find ourselves kind of asking, I can't seem to get a hold of so-and-so. What other strategies do I have to try? Let's go back here. We also bring people together. We have our annual conference coming up at the end of October. Every first Monday of every month, we do what we call office hours. This is limited to members only, but we usually have a little bit of a presentation on some, recently issued report, or some, data set that's come out, or something that's germane in the education sphere at that particular time. And then we open it up for members to engage, either on the topic that's been presented, or just on things that are happening. This started during the pandemic as a way for members who, found themselves not able to meet with each other, just to be able to get together and commiserate and share what was going on in their states, learn from each other, ask for advice from each other, and so forth and so on. And it continues to be very effective to this day. So you should see invitations to that in our monthly member newsletter. We send invitations out separately as well that should give you an opportunity to sign up for those office hours. We're also open to any topic. If you feel like there's a topic that would make a great subject area for the office hours, that's great. Obviously, you're participating in New Member Institute, so you know what that's about. We occasionally will do regional meetings in the areas that the graph, the map that I showed you earlier. We just did one in the Northeast. We had, pretty decent turnout. It just gives those states an opportunity to kind of present some of the things their board is working on, engage with their peers in terms of things that they might have questions around, or be inspired. sometimes just listening to other boards tell about what they're working on kind of leads people to say, oh, that's really kind of interesting. I'd love to learn more. And maybe we ought to be doing that in our state. We also host a bunch of webinars. We've got one coming up even tomorrow. If you're interested in high school redesign, we have got just a fantastic assembly of people who are working in that space for a webinar that we're hosting tomorrow. We often will do webinars in partnership with other organizations. We've done it with the Data Quality Campaign, with the National Conference of State Legislatures, with the Council of Chief State School Officers, with other advocacy groups, Education Trust, and so forth and so on. We love partnering and we love spreading the good news, because the role we play in those webinars is to make sure people are aware that state boards are actively involved in these policy areas and are making a difference each and every day in the work of education. So finally, I want to highlight to you the priorities that kind of currently represent the NASBE repertoire. And this will be, we pride ourselves on being member driven. So the way these priorities emerged was really through surveys of our membership that we do regularly, that we also use to support the conference planning committee when it thinks about what sessions ought to we have at conference. And these are the topics that come up. Early childhood education is often one that's frequently addressed, because people know that's an area that access and quality can be improved and that really lay the foundations for a great educational experience for students. Teachers and leaders are fundamental to an excellent educational process. Right now, coming off the pandemic, we're seeing people talking about shortages, retention efforts, challenges of enrollment at educator prep programs, meeting the needs of rural areas and certain subject areas. So that's a key area of our attention. High school redesign is increasingly emerging as people understand that, hey, maybe we can do better in terms of high school and both its preparation for post-secondary experiences or for careers and the workforce. We see new models emerging. We see sometimes the realities. Some of this comes from listening to student voice, where we hear high school students saying, I don't see the relevancy. I kind of am following lockstep, taking these courses, but I really don't see where it's leading. And then other students who have deep work-based learning opportunities saying, hey, this is really fantastic. I love what we're doing here. This really engages me, and I really feel like I'm being well prepared for my future. High school redesign. Assessment and accountability is a hot topic because people, we've been in this mode of standards-based reform where assessments and accountability are being, are levers for driving school improvement, and yet people question, are these the right assessments? How are these assessments being used? Are we working well enough with teachers and districts to leverage the data that's coming from those assessments? Are our accountability structures fair, and are they usable? Are they driving the kind of improvement that we want to see? And then last but certainly not least, the whole notion of paying attention to school health and student well-being. You've seen reports come out about the mental health state of some of our students, suicidal ideation among girls, the impact of social media that's having. Even the Surgeon General of the United States has put out reports about some of the traumatic challenges that our students are facing. And in fact, it's a bipartisan issue where people feel like, look, our kids are hurting. What can we be doing to address some of those needs? And so we're doing some great work, and you'll hear about that. Keep up the great work you do each and every day. And remember that we're here to support you. Never hesitate to reach out. Never hesitate to ask for our assistance. And to Steve's point, to find out what other states are doing in the interest of issues you're wrestling with, because through that we will raise your awareness. We will value and raise your engagement. And at the end of the day, what we really want to do is see states taking action and boards leading that action in the interest of an education system that gives every and each child an opportunity to be successful. So with that, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in August.